Black CEO ordered out of airport terminal minutes later, his private jet went viral. Hello everyone, before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the story. Sir, you need to leave the terminal. Now. The voice cracked through the airport waiting area like a sudden thunderclap. Conversation stopped. Laptop keyboards paused mid-keystroke. Even the rolling sound of suitcase wheels seemed to fade for a moment. Marcus Ellison slowly lifted his eyes from the slim silver laptop resting on his knees. He sat in the front row of seats near the large digital departure boards, rows of glowing blue screens listing flights to New York, Chicago, London. Travelers moved through the terminal behind him in a steady stream, dragging carry-ons and checking their phones. Marcus looked calm. Almost too calm. 39 years old. Athletic build. Dark, tailored slacks. A clean white shirt with the sleeves rolled just enough to show a watch that looked simple but wasn't. Beside him sat a compact black suitcase. Not designer. Not flashy. Just quiet. The kind of luggage that belonged to someone who traveled a lot. Standing over him now was a tall airport staff supervisor in a navy uniform jacket. His posture leaned forward aggressively, one hand on his hip, the other finger pointed directly at Marcus's chest. "You heard me?" the man said louder. "You can't sit here." Several passengers nearby turned their heads. A woman across the aisle lowered her coffee slowly. Two college students nearby exchanged looks. Marcus blinked once, then closed the laptop halfway. "Is there a problem?" he asked. His voice was level. "Controlled." The supervisor scoffed. "This area is for private aviation passengers only," he said, gesturing toward the polished glass doors leading to the private terminal corridor. Then his eyes ran over Marcus's clothes. From the rolled sleeves, to the simple watch, to the unbranded suitcase. His lip curled slightly, and clearly he added, "You walked in from the public terminal." A quiet murmur rippled through the waiting area. Someone whispered behind a newspaper. "Yeah, doesn't look like a private jet guy." Marcus didn't react. Not a sigh. Not a shift in his seat. He simply watched the man. Outside the giant terminal windows behind them, the runway stretched under the pale morning sun. Jets moved slowly in the distance like enormous metal birds gliding across concrete. The supervisor mistook Marcus's silence for hesitation. "Sir," he said again, this time sharper, louder. "You don't belong here." That did it. Now the entire row of seats was watching. Phones slowly appeared in hands. The supervisor leaned even closer, lowering his voice, but not his hostility. "I'm not going to ask again," he said. "You need to stand up and leave this terminal immediately." Marcus looked up at him. Really looked this time. The kind of look that lasted just a second longer than normal. Not angry. Not embarrassed. Just measuring. Then he leaned back in his seat slightly. Calm as ever. And said 4 words. "I'm waiting for someone." The supervisor laughed under his breath. "Oh yeah." He gestured toward the glass runway beyond the windows. Who exactly? Marcus turned his head slowly toward the runway outside. Far across the tarmac, something large and white was beginning to taxi toward the terminal gates. Its engines hummed faintly through the glass. Marcus watched it approach. Then he answered quietly, "My ride." For a moment, the terminal stayed quiet. Not silent. Just that strange kind of quiet that happens when strangers sense something uncomfortable unfolding in public. The airport supervisor straightened his jacket and glanced around, noticing the attention now gathering. A few passengers were openly watching. A couple more pretended to check their phones while clearly listening. He didn't like that. Authority worked best when no one questioned it. So he raised his voice slightly. "This seating area," he said, tapping the metal armrest beside Marcus, "is reserved for private aviation passengers." His tone carried the kind of forced patience people used when they believed they were explaining something obvious. Marcus remained seated, still calm, still watching the runway through the giant terminal windows. Outside aircraft moved slowly along the tarmac like silent machines in a carefully choreographed dance. The supervisor followed Marcus's gaze for a second, then scoffed. "Let me guess," he said. "You're waiting for someone important." Marcus didn't answer. That only seemed to irritate the man more. He leaned down slightly, lowering his voice just enough to sound condescending rather than loud. "Look," he said, "this isn't the public side of the airport. Private flights board through this terminal." His finger gestured toward the frosted glass doors behind the check-in desk. "You can't just walk in here and sit down." Behind them, the quiet murmur of the terminal began to grow. Two businessmen near the coffee stand glanced over their shoulders. A woman with a rolling carry-on slowed her pace. Someone further down the row subtly lifted their phone. Marcus noticed. He always noticed. Not the phones. Not the whispers. But the tone. He had heard that tone before. The supervisor crossed his arms, now clearly convinced he had already figured the situation out. "You probably came through the wrong entrance," he continued. "It happens." Then he tilted his head slightly. "But you need to move along." Marcus slowly closed the laptop on his knees. Not with frustration. Not with urgency. Just calmly. Click. He placed one hand on the top of the suitcase beside him. The supervisor mistook the movement as compliance and stepped back half a pace. "Good," he said. "That's the right decision." Marcus looked up again, his eyes steady. "Actually," he said, "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." A faint laugh came from somewhere behind them. The supervisor shook his head. "No," he replied, now smiling in that tight way people do when they believe they are humoring someone unreasonable. "You're not." He gestured toward the terminal exit. "You can head back through security and wait in the public terminal like everyone else." Marcus didn't move. A few seconds passed. The supervisor's smile faded. Then he sighed and reached toward the radio clipped to his shoulder. "Security," he said into the mic, his voice firm now. "I've got a situation in the private terminal seating area." He glanced down at Marcus again. "Possible trespass." Across the terminal, a young airport operations employee behind the check-in desk looked up from her tablet. Her eyes moved from the screen to Marcus. Then back to the screen again. Her brow slowly furrowed. Something about the name on the flight manifest suddenly didn't add up. The radio on the supervisor's shoulder crackled softly. "Security en route." The words weren't loud, but they changed the atmosphere instantly. Airports had their own kind of tension. The moment the word security entered the air, people paid attention. A man sitting 2 rows away slowly lowered his newspaper. The woman with the rolling carry-on stopped walking entirely now, pretending to adjust the strap on her purse while watching from the corner of her eye. And somewhere near the charging station, someone's phone camera lifted a little higher. Marcus noticed the shift. Not in panic. Just observation. He had spent most of his adult life in rooms where tension changed the temperature of the air. Boardrooms. Negotiations. Deal tables worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Compared to those rooms, this airport terminal felt almost quiet. The supervisor, however, seemed pleased with the new direction things were taking. He clipped the radio back onto his shoulder and straightened up. "Security will be here in a moment," he said calmly. Then he nodded toward Marcus's suitcase. "You can take your things and start heading toward the public terminal." Marcus didn't move. Not an inch. The supervisor exhaled sharply through his nose. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Marcus lifted his eyes again. "Am I the supervisor?" Frowned slightly. "You're sitting in a restricted terminal." "I'm waiting for my flight." The supervisor shook his head immediately. No, you're not. His confidence now carried the weight of someone who believed he had already solved the situation. Private passengers check in at the desk, he said, pointing toward the quiet counter across the room. And they don't sit around here with laptops like they're at a coffee shop. A quiet laugh came from somewhere behind them. Marcus heard it. He didn't look. He had learned something a long time ago. Once a crowd decided they understood a situation, facts usually arrived too late. Two airport security officers entered the terminal through the sliding doors at the far end. Their uniforms were darker than the supervisors, their posture heavier, the quiet authority of people used to removing problems rather than discussing them. The supervisor waved them over. "Gentlemen," he said. He gestured toward Marcus like he was pointing out a misplaced suitcase. This individual wandered into the private aviation seating area. Marcus remained seated as the two officers approached. One of them glanced briefly at Marcus, then at the suitcase, then back at the supervisor. "What's the issue?" the officer asked. Refusing to leave, the supervisor replied. The officer shifted his stance slightly and looked down at Marcus. "Sir," he said evenly, "this area is restricted." Marcus closed his laptop fully now. The quiet click of the hinge seemed louder than it should have been. He placed the device carefully into the suitcase beside him. Then he stood. Not quickly, not reluctantly, just calmly. Now he was eye level with the supervisor.
And a few inches taller.
The officer gestured toward the glass doors leading back toward the main airport terminal. "I'm going to need you to step out with us." A pause settled over the room. Phones were definitely recording now. Marcus looked past them, through the massive windows toward the runway. Something large was beginning to move across the tarmac. Its white body caught the sunlight as it slowly turned toward the private gates. Marcus watched it for a moment. Then he said quietly, "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The supervisor laughed. "Oh, really?" Marcus nodded once. "Yes." Another pause. Then he added calmly, "My flight just landed." For a brief second, no one moved. The supervisor stared at Marcus, clearly expecting him to start explaining himself. Instead, Marcus simply stood there with one hand resting lightly on the handle of his suitcase. Calm. Too calm for someone supposedly being escorted out of a restricted airport terminal. The two security officers exchanged a quick glance. They had seen this situation before. Confused passengers. People entering the wrong area. Arguments about boarding gates. But something about Marcus's composure didn't match the usual pattern. Most people protested. Some got defensive. Others became nervous the moment security appeared. Marcus did none of those things. He simply watched the runway. The supervisor broke the silence first. "Oh, your flight just landed," he said with a short laugh. "Well, that's convenient." A few people nearby chuckled quietly. The supervisor gestured toward the runway outside the tall glass windows. "There are a lot of flights landing today," he added. "That doesn't mean one of them belongs to you." The officers shifted slightly, still waiting. Marcus said nothing. Across the terminal behind the polished check-in counter, the young airport operations employee stared down at the tablet in her hands. Her name was Alicia Rivera, 26 years old. 2 years into her job managing private aviation arrivals. Normally, the system was routine. Flight numbers, passenger manifests, ground crew timing. But the name on her screen had just caught her attention. She zoomed in on the manifest again. ELISONGLOBALAVIATION Private Arrival Gate 3. Passenger Marcus Ellison. Alicia blinked. Her eyes slowly lifted from the tablet. Across the terminal. Toward the man standing beside the security officers. The man the supervisor was currently trying to remove.
She looked back at the screen again.
Then at Marcus. Then back to the screen. Her brow furrowed. That couldn't be right. The supervisor's voice snapped her attention back to the confrontation.
"Sir," he said sharply, now losing patience.
I'm done arguing. He turned toward the officers. Please, escort him out. One of the officers stepped slightly forward. Sir, he said calmly to Marcus, we're going to need you to come with us. Marcus looked at him, not offended, not intimidated, just thoughtful. Before we do that, Marcus said quietly, you might want to check the arrivals board. The supervisor rolled his eyes. We already know what flights are arriving. Marcus tilted his head slightly toward the check-in counter. Do you all eyes slowly turned in that direction? Alicia suddenly felt the weight of the entire room shifting toward her. Her tablet screen still displayed the same name. Marcus Ellison. Her heart began to beat faster. If the manifest was correct, then the man standing in front of security wasn't trespassing. He was the primary passenger of the private jet currently taxiing toward the gate. Alicia hesitated, just for a second. Then she spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the terminal like a small crack in the tension. Sir, the supervisor turned. Yes, Alicia looked from the tablet to Marcus, then back to the supervisor. I think, she said carefully, you might want to see this. The supervisor frowned. I'm sorry, what he said. Alicia hesitated for just a moment, feeling the pressure of every pair of eyes in the terminal slowly shifting toward her. She lifted the tablet slightly. There's a private arrival scheduled at gate P3, she explained. The supervisor waved a dismissive hand. Yes, we know that. A Gulfstream coming in from Dallas. His eyes flicked briefly toward Marcus. That has nothing to do with this situation. Alicia swallowed. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tablet. Actually, it might. The supervisor's expression hardened. What are you talking about? Alicia turned the screen so he could see. On the display, the manifest glowed clearly under the terminal lights. ELLISONGLOBALAVIATION, private arrival, gate P3 passenger Marcus Ellison. The supervisor looked down at the tablet. Then back at Marcus. Then back at the tablet again. For a second, confusion flickered across his face. But pride moved faster than doubt. He shook his head. That doesn't prove anything. Marcus said nothing. The two security officers were now looking at the screen as well. One of them leaned slightly closer. Is that the passenger name? He asked Alicia, quietly. She nodded. Yes, sir. The officer's eyes moved slowly back toward Marcus. The supervisor scoffed again. People share names all the time, he said quickly. Just because the passenger is named Marcus Ellison doesn't mean this guy is that passenger. A few people nearby murmured.
Someone whispered that's fair.
Another voice quietly replied, still kind of weird though. The tension in the terminal shifted. It wasn't certainty. Not yet, Tet. But something else had entered the room. Doubt. The officer standing closest to Marcus tilted his head slightly. Sir, he said calmly, do you have identification? Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The movement was slow and deliberate. Not rushed. Not defensive. Just careful. He pulled out a slim leather wallet, opened it, then removed a single black card. Not a credit card. Not an ID badge. Something else. He held it between two fingers for a moment before handing it over. The officer took the card, looked down. His eyebrows lifted almost immediately. The supervisor leaned closer. What is it? He asked impatiently. The officer didn't answer right away. He simply turned the card so the supervisor could read it. Embossed across the matte black surface in clean silver lettering were 4 words MARCUSALISO, NFOUNDER, and CEO below that ELLISO and GLOBAAOL. A TION for the first time since the confrontation began. The supervisor didn't speak. The room seemed to shrink around the small rectangle of black metal resting in the officer's hand. Phones were still recording. Passengers were still watching. And outside the massive terminal windows, the white Gulfstream jet continued taxiing slowly toward Gate 3. Closer now. Much closer. For a moment, no one spoke. The black metal card rested in the officer's hand like it weighed far more than it should. The officer read the engraving again. Then once more. His posture changed slightly, not dramatically. Just enough that the tension in his shoulders softened. He looked at Marcus, then at the supervisor. "You might want to take a look at this," he said quietly. The supervisor grabbed the card from his hand. His eyes scanned the lettering quickly. MARCUSCLLISO and CEOELISO and GLOBAALAV. IIATION, he scoffed almost immediately. "Anyone can print a card," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. Marcus watched him calmly. The supervisor flipped the card over as if expecting some hidden proof on the back. There was none, just the same matte black surface. Around them, the small crowd of passengers leaned closer. Phones remained raised. The supervisor handed the card back to the officer with a shrug. "Still doesn't prove he belongs here."
Marcus didn't argue.
He didn't reach for the card. Instead, he turned his head slowly toward the runway outside the glass wall. The Gulfstream jet was now approaching the private terminal gates. Large. White. Its engines hummed low across the tarmac. The supervisor followed Marcus's gaze and smirked. "Nice plane," he said casually. "Not yours, though." Marcus folded his hands loosely in front of him. "That's where you're wrong." The supervisor shook his head. "No," he replied quickly. "What's wrong is you trying to stall." He turned toward the officers again. "Let's finish this." The officer who had first taken the card hesitated. His eyes flicked once more toward the approaching jet, then toward Alicia at the check-in desk.
She was still holding the tablet.
Still staring at the screen. Still staring at Marcus. The officer exhaled slowly. "Maybe we should confirm the manifest," he suggested. The supervisor's patience snapped. "I already told you the passenger name means nothing." Marcus spoke again. His voice remained calm, measured. "You're right," he said. "Names can be common." The supervisor crossed his arms, satisfied. "Exactly." Marcus nodded slightly toward the runway again. "But aircraft registration numbers usually aren't." That made the officer glance back outside. Painted near the tail of the Gulfstream jet was a bold registration code. NEGA1. Alicia's eyes widened. Her fingers moved quickly across the tablet screen. The supervisor noticed the sudden change in her expression. "What now?" he asked impatiently. Alicia looked up slowly. The color had drained slightly from her face.
"Sir," her voice was quieter now.
But it carried across the terminal all the same. "That aircraft," she turned the tablet so everyone could see, "is registered to Ellison Global Aviation." The officer holding the black card looked back at Marcus again. Then at the supervisor. Then at the jet, slowly rolling toward Gate 3. The supervisor didn't laugh this time. Outside, the Gulfstream completed its turn and began taxiing directly toward the private gate. Closer. Closer. And suddenly the quiet hum of its engines felt very loud inside the terminal. No one in the terminal spoke. The only sound now was the low, distant rumble of jet engines rolling across the runway. Outside the glass wall, the white Gulfstream continued taxiing slowly toward the private gate. Its wings glinted in the morning light. Its engines hummed with quiet authority. And suddenly every person in the terminal seemed aware of it. Phones shifted direction. People leaned closer to the windows. Even the security officers turned their bodies slightly toward the aircraft. The supervisor remained frozen for a moment. Then he shook his head as if trying to push away the obvious. "It's just a coincidence," he said quickly. No one answered him. Marcus stood exactly where he had been the entire time. Calm. Still. Watching. The aircraft rolled closer to Gate 3. A ground crew vehicle pulled alongside it. Two crew members stepped out in bright reflective vests, guiding the jet toward the stop line. The engines gradually lowered to a softer idle. Inside the terminal, the tension thickened. The officer still holding Marcus's black card looked again at the aircraft outside, then back at Marcus. "You said your flight just landed?" he said slowly. Marcus nodded once. "Yes." The supervisor scoffed again, though the sound carried far less confidence now. "You expect us to believe that's your plane?" Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't smile. He simply gestured lightly toward the window. "That aircraft outside," he said calmly, "belongs to Ellison Global Aviation." The officer looked down at the card again. Then, back to the jet. The logo painted near the rear door of the aircraft was now visible. ELLISONGLOBAL, the letters were large. Impossible to miss. A small ripple moved through the crowd.
Someone whispered, "Oh my God."
Another voice said quietly, "That's the same name." Phones lifted higher. The supervisor turned toward Alicia. "Check the manifest again," he demanded. She didn't need to. Her screen still displayed the same entry. "Passenger Marcus Ellison," her voice came out almost as a whisper. "It's him." The officer slowly handed the black card back to Marcus. His posture had changed completely now. "Sir," he said respectfully. "Are you the owner of Ellison Global Aviation?" Marcus took the card, slid it calmly back into his wallet.
Then looked at the supervisor. Not angry.
Not triumphant. Just direct. "Yes," he said. "I am." Outside, the aircraft door began to open.
And suddenly, the entire terminal realized something all at once.
They hadn't been escorting a trespasser out of the private terminal. They'd been trying to remove the man whose jet had just landed outside. The change in the room was immediate. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was unmistakable. The supervisor, who only minutes ago had been pointing a finger in Marcus's face, now stood frozen beside the security officers, staring toward the runway like a man trying to rewrite the last 10 minutes in his head. Outside the glass wall, the Gulfstream's engines powered down to a gentle idle. The aircraft settled into position at Gate 3. Ground crew moved quickly around it, placing wheel chocks and guiding the portable stairs toward the cabin door. Everything about the scene outside looked organized. Expected. Normal. Except for what had just happened inside the terminal. A murmur spread through the crowd. "He owns the jet." "Wait, that's actually his plane, I think it is." Phones were no longer discreet. People were openly filming now. One man leaned toward his friend and whispered they just tried to kick the owner out. The security officer who had first taken Marcus's card cleared his throat. His tone was completely different now. "Sir," he said respectfully, "I apologize for the confusion." Marcus met his eyes. "No confusion," Marcus replied calmly. "You were doing your job." The officer nodded slightly, but the supervisor didn't speak. His face had gone pale. He looked once more at the aircraft outside, then at Marcus, then at the crowd watching him. The weight of the moment had finally settled. Marcus turned toward the window again. The cabin door of the Gulfstream swung open. A flight attendant appeared at the top of the stairs. A few seconds later, a man in a pilot's uniform stepped down onto the tarmac. He adjusted his headset, scanned the terminal windows, and spotted Marcus immediately. Even through the thick airport glass, recognition was obvious. The pilot straightened. Then he raised one hand in a brief salute toward the terminal. A small gesture, but it landed like thunder inside the room. Someone behind Marcus whispered, "That's his crew." The supervisor shifted his weight awkwardly. His authority had drained from him like air from a punctured tire. For the first time since the confrontation began, he addressed Marcus without accusation. "Mr. Ellison," he said slowly. Marcus turned. "Yes?" The supervisor hesitated. Every word now carried the weight of a mistake already witnessed by dozens of strangers. "I think," he said carefully, "there may have been a misunderstanding." Marcus studied him for a moment. Then he glanced toward the phones recording everything. The murmuring crowd, the jet waiting outside, and finally back to the supervisor. No, Marcus said calmly. There wasn't. The words hung in the air. No, Marcus said calmly. There wasn't. For a moment, the supervisor didn't respond. The murmur of the crowd behind him grew louder now, like a quiet wave slowly building across the terminal. Phones were still recording. Someone whispered near the charging station, "This is going to be all over the internet."
The supervisor swallowed.
His posture, once stiff with authority, now looked uncertain.
His shoulders dipped slightly as if the weight of the room had suddenly become very real.
He glanced briefly at the security officers. Neither of them spoke. Both had stepped half a pace back from Marcus without even realizing it. The officer who had taken Marcus's card earlier cleared his throat again. "Mr. Ellison," he said respectfully, "your aircraft is ready at Gate 3. Marcus nodded once. "Thank you." Outside, the ground crew finished positioning the stairs against the side of the Gulfstream. The pilot waited at the bottom of the steps, headset hanging around his neck, eyes still occasionally lifting toward the terminal windows. Waiting. The supervisor looked from the jet to Marcus to the growing circle of passengers still watching. Regret crept slowly across his face. "I may have jumped to conclusions," he said quietly. A few people in the crowd scoffed at that. One man muttered under his breath, "You think Marcus didn't smile?" He didn't look satisfied. He simply studied the supervisor for a moment. "You didn't ask a single question," Marcus said evenly. The supervisor lowered his eyes. Marcus continued, "You saw me sitting here and you decided I didn't belong." The words were calm, but they carried weight. "You didn't check the manifest. You didn't call the desk. You didn't even ask my name." Behind them, Alicia looked down at her tablet again, uncomfortable with how accurate that statement was. The supervisor opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again. There wasn't much he could argue. Marcus picked up the handle of his suitcase. The simple black bag rolled quietly across the polished floor as he turned toward the exit doors leading to the private gate. The security officers instinctively stepped aside, clearing the path. But Marcus stopped after only a few steps. He turned back once more. The supervisor stood exactly where Marcus had left him, caught between the authority he had tried to exercise and the mistake everyone had now witnessed. Marcus held his gaze. "You told me I didn't belong in this terminal," Marcus said calmly. He gestured toward the runway outside, toward the aircraft waiting beside Gate 3. "That plane out there," Marcus continued, "is the reason this terminal exists." A hush fell over the room. Marcus paused for just a second, then added quietly, "And it's mine." No one laughed this time. The words landed in the terminal with the weight of a truth that could no longer be ignored. Marcus stood quietly beside his suitcase, the reflection of the runway stretching across the polished airport floor. Outside the glass, the Gulfstream waited like a silent witness to everything that had just unfolded. The supervisor looked toward the jet again, the logo on its side. ELLISO and GLOBAL, it was impossible to pretend he hadn't seen it. The crowd behind them had grown thicker now. Who had been walking through the terminal had slowed down. Some stood openly watching, others leaned against columns, pretending not to stare. But everyone was listening. One of the security officers finally broke the silence. "Sir," he said carefully to Marcus, "your crew is waiting?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, they are." The supervisor shifted awkwardly. The authority he had carried earlier, the confident posture, the sharp voice, the pointing finger, had all faded. Now he looked like a man standing in front of a mistake he couldn't rewind. "I apologize," he said slowly. The words came out stiff, unpracticed. Marcus studied him for a moment, not judging, just measuring. Behind them, Alicia quietly set the tablet down on the desk. She could still feel the tension buzzing through the room like electricity.
Marcus spoke again, his tone calm but unmistakably firm.
"You didn't ask who I was?" The supervisor nodded faintly. Marcus continued. "You didn't check the flight manifest?"
Another nod.
And you didn't give me the same courtesy you would have given someone else sitting in that chair. The supervisor lowered his eyes. No one in the terminal missed what Marcus meant. The silence that followed was heavier than anything said out loud. Outside, the pilot, at the base of the aircraft stairs, glanced at his watch and then back toward the terminal doors. Still waiting, Marcus finally picked up the handle of his suitcase. The wheels rolled softly across the floor as he began walking toward the private gate exit. This time, the path opened immediately. The two security officers stepped aside without hesitation. The officer who had spoken earlier gave a small nod of respect. "Safe flight, sir." Marcus paused beside him briefly. "Thank you," he said. Then he continued toward the glass doors. Behind him, the supervisor remained standing in the center of the terminal floor. Phones were still recording. Whispers still spread across the room. But the energy had completely shifted. 10 minutes earlier, the man walking toward the gate had been treated like he didn't belong in the private terminal. Now, everyone in the room understood something different. He didn't just belong there. He owned the reason it existed. The glass doors slid open with a soft mechanical hum. Marcus stepped through them without looking back. The air outside the terminal was cooler, carrying the faint scent of jet fuel and the low vibration of idling engines. The massive Gulfstream waited only a short distance away, now its white body gleaming beneath the late morning sun. Ground crew members moved around the aircraft with practiced precision. One technician finished securing the wheel chocks. Another rolled a small service cart away from the wing. At the bottom of the portable stairs, the pilot stood waiting. When Marcus stepped onto the private tarmac, the pilot immediately straightened. "Good morning, Mr. Ellison," he said with a respectful nod. Marcus returned the greeting with a small smile. "Morning, Captain." Behind them, through the tall glass wall of the terminal, dozens of faces still watched. Phones remained raised. What had started as a simple confrontation had turned into something far more public than anyone inside had expected. Inside the terminal, the supervisor remained standing in nearly the same spot. He hadn't moved much since Marcus walked away.
Around him, passengers slowly began talking again.
Some shook their heads. Others whispered. One man near the window laughed quietly. Man tried to throw the owner out. The supervisor heard it. He heard all of it. But he didn't respond. He simply stared out toward the runway where Marcus now walked beside the aircraft. Outside, Marcus reached the base of the stairs. The flight attendant standing at the top greeted him warmly. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Ellison." "Thank you," Marcus replied. He paused for a moment before stepping up, just long enough to glance back toward the terminal. Through the glass, he could see the crowd, the security officers, Alicia at the desk, and the supervisor still standing there. For a second, their eyes met again across the distance. Not with anger. Not with triumph. Just recognition. Marcus gave a small nod. Then he turned and climbed the steps into the aircraft. The door closed gently behind him. Inside the cockpit, the pilot's voice came over the intercom a moment later. "Ground crew confirms clearance. We'll be taxiing shortly." Outside, the engines began to power up again. Low at first, then stronger. Inside the terminal, the supervisor watched the aircraft begin to move, slowly rolling away from Gate 3. And with it went the quiet man he had been so certain didn't belong there. Only now did the full realization settle over him. Marcus Ellison had never needed permission to sit in that terminal. He had been the reason the terminal existed in the first place. The Gulfstream rolled steadily down the private taxiway. Inside the cabin, the door sealed with a soft click as Marcus settled into the wide leather seat near the window. The interior lighting glowed warm and quiet, a sharp contrast to the tension he had just walked away from. Outside, the engines deepened to a steady roar as the aircraft turned toward the runway. Marcus looked out the oval window. The airport terminal slid slowly past in the distance, its glass walls reflecting the afternoon sun. From this angle, the building looked smaller, almost ordinary. Inside that terminal, the supervisor was still standing near the seating area. The crowd had begun to thin now, travelers returning to their flights and conversations, but the whispers remained. Everyone who had witnessed the moment knew they had seen something unusual, something uncomfortable. The security officers had already stepped away, returning to their posts with quiet professionalism. Alicia remained behind the counter, her tablet resting on the desk. She watched the aircraft through the window as it moved farther down the runway path. Part of her still replayed the moment in her head. The finger pointing, the accusation, the calm response, and the realization that followed. The supervisor finally turned away from the window. The authority he had carried earlier was gone. He walked slowly toward the empty row of seats where Marcus had been sitting. The chair was still there, the same place he had pointed to earlier. "You can't sit here." Now it felt different, quieter. He rested one hand on the back of the chair and exhaled slowly. Across the runway, the Gulfstream reached the far end of the taxiway and paused. Then the engines surged. The aircraft accelerated down the runway with smooth, unstoppable force. Within seconds, its nose lifted. The landing gear left the ground, and the jet climbed into the sky above the city. Inside the cabin, Marcus watched the airport shrink beneath the wing. He had seen moments like this before. Different airports, different rooms, different people convinced they knew exactly who belonged somewhere and who didn't. But Marcus had learned something long ago. You didn't always need to argue with people who underestimated you. Sometimes the most powerful answer was simply letting reality arrive. The aircraft climbed higher into the clouds. Marcus closed his laptop and looked out the window one last time. Then he spoke quietly, almost to himself. "I didn't raise my voice." A faint reflection of the sky moved across the glass. "I raised the standard." And somewhere far below the airport terminal continued its busy routine, now carrying the quiet memory of the man they had tried to remove from a place that existed because of him.